So it is live right now, so you can continue.
Assalamu alaikum wa Ramadan Mubarak, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Imam Fahim Shuaibe for giving me the opportunity to share just a small portion of my studies or research as it pertains to the overall topic of this Ramadan session on the resurrection. I'm sorry, one moment. On the resurrection and the renaissance of al-Islam in the world. Last week, his concentration was on the rise, and I'd like to provide a very short review of that. And then my purpose is to expound on a small portion of what he talked about in the rise. So with that being said, last week, Imam Fahim, first of all, started with the introduction, described the whole idea of the contestedness of Africa, the word Africa, for describing the continent. He also talked about the mere size of Africa and the political reasons why it doesn't show in the same relative to the rest of the world. He also talked about the historical landscape of al-Islam, as well as some of the problems in post-Renaissance and modern Muslim cultural thinking. From that, we went on to talk about the heritage of Africans, as well as the European powers that define Africa's boundaries, and talked about the history of Islam in West Africa, and as it relates to some of the wars or battles that took place and the grabbing of power from one entity to another. He also spoke about the spread of Islam. What were some of the factors that attributed to the spread of Islam in West Africa? And that's what my role is today, is to talk a little bit more in depth about those factors. One moment, please. All right, so one of the factors that he talked about that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail is the trading relations. And the traders were the earliest areas of Islam, as was mentioned last week. The trade routes, which connect North Africa with West and Central Africa, gave great opportunities for movement of commodities and ideas between North African countries and West African communities. Imam Fahim mentioned last week that there was really no body of water separating the two. So there was there was contact between the various communities of North African Muslims and West African communities. And the traders had free movements across the local and among the local people, whereby exchange of goods and ideas occurred. And the contact was regular and unbroken. Trading centers grew into urban areas, and these social economic centers in time became Muslim centers. I'll say more about this a little later. So examples of these are Timbuktu in Mali, Kankan in Guinea-Bissau, Bandaka in the Ivory Coast, Salga in Kumasi in Ghana, Kano, Katsina, and Borno in northern Nigeria. Islam helped the small states to expand and build large empires. Originally, each people gave its obedience and loyalty to only its king, whose area of control had territorial limits. But faith has no territorial limit to expansion. Thus, many small states came together under Islam and were able to form and build a large empire. An example of this is the Mali Empire, which grew up from the unification of a number of Mande chieftaincies chieftaincies, chieftaincies to them. Islam provided a bond of unity among the different clans which composed the empire. An example lies in the opportunity which Islam offered for the areas between the Niger and the Chad to have a semblance of unity through the movement inspired by Uthman Fodio. This area had earlier been divided into many little states, very often in mutual enmity, at times paying allegiance to greater states to the east and west. This is also indicated by Adelaides when he says the Sokoto Caliphate owes its successful establishment far more to the common bond provided by Islam than to any military superiority of the Mujahideen over their adversaries. And this is not to paint paint an idealistic value of the relationships between the various empires and the various territorial communities. There was strife between them, but overall, Islam did function as a unification force for them. Another way in which Islam spread in West Africa was Islam as a religion of the book. It was a religion of intellectual and material culture. Islam as a religion of the book, al-Kitab, this gave rise to literacy, that is, a desire for knowledge to read, write, and keep records, and the creation and establishment of schools. Students of all ages were taught Arabic, including Islamic theology and law, which was then the only vehicle for literary culture. Graduates of these Quranic schools became officials and personnel of the administration and advisors to the rulers. Thus, learned men occupied positions of importance in the community. In this way, it became an incentive to acquire learning. What I've shown here, this is taken from Dr. Rudolph Bilal Ware's book, Walking Quran. It just shows a Quran school in Dakar, Senegal, from an early 20th century French postcard. So you can see the very minimalist, the very simple schools that were formed without really any resources for the replication of Quran and Islamic thought. Next, I'd like to share some pictures with you, and these are actually very recent. These were taken in January, actually, in the Senegambian region. And my reason for sharing this with you is just to reiterate or to impress upon you that these are centuries and centuries that Islam has continued to survive and to be prominent in these areas. So this is a visit to a school in actually Tuba, and you can see the girls. There was a school, and it's a residential school, and it's divided in the sense that there's a section for the girls and a section for the boys as well. And we actually met there two African American brothers whose families had sent them there to study at the school. Also, just to show you, in the background here is, you can see this young man, and behind him are a number of other young Muslim men. This is just recent. This is actually an exam. And it turns out that it's a very big deal in the communities. This is in the Gambia, and it's in the city or village called Ganjour. And it's a very, very well-attended occasion. The community comes out, they cook, they just kind of shows here where they sit. And it's an entire day of listening to Quran recitation. And then finally, of course, there is a decision made by the judges who they feel is the best, but it's very embedded into the community. It's something that's looked forward to each year. And this on the far right here, again, is the school. This is kind of the other side of the school where the females are shown. This is the other side of the school where the males are present as well. And getting back to the, this is in Ganjur. This is actually a mosque. It's called the Sand Dunes Mosque. And I didn't show the picture of the mosque itself, but it actually has on the upper floor about 600 of these beds here, these twin bunk beds where students come in and spend the amount of time learning Quran. So it's actually a school under very, very poor conditions. And that's another thing that is so inspiring, is that under the very little material benefit, etc., very little money, that Islamic education has still managed to survive in the Gambia. This is in spite of colonialism, in spite of the slave trade, that it still stands and is operational. This is another school. This school is in the Gambia, and this is a residential school. And we were invited there, and this is one of the students did recite Quran for us, which was such an honor. And then right underneath, here's a picture of, we were in Tuba, the city of glad tidings. And in Tuba, we were able to observe a lot of activity at an educational center in which we were staying. And these were young men who come in, and they would sticker, and it was so beautiful. I wish I could actually show it, show sound or share the sound with you. And it was very interesting because you can't see it on this picture, but there are two young men on opposite sides. They're probably a few years older, and they are in control, and they are in charge of this group. They're listening to them. They were listening very intently, and they kind of helped them train them. So there was no adult present for this. Next, what I'd like to do is share a little bit about Dr. Rudolph T. Ware III. He goes by the name in the Muslim community of Bilal Ware. And just, again, talking about that tradition of Quranic teaching and Islamic teaching, he comments in his book, The Walking Quran, that the classical Quran schooling and its contemporary manifestations in West Africa are based on what were once broadly held Islamic ideals about educating the whole,
That's okay.
the whole of a human being, rather than the narrow transmission of discursive, and I'm going to define it as words, not action, knowledge. Islamic knowledge is embodied knowledge, and that's a very strong, I guess, ethic that we could see there amongst the communities that we visited. That it wasn't just about memorizing. That was part of memorizing Quran, but traditions going back centuries and centuries ago, it was all about embodiment. And to that extent, there is a quote from Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba that knowledge does not consist in a collection of citations or hearsay. Rather, it is the light of the Nur that guides the heart of whom seeks truth. Another factor that contributed to the spread of Islam in West Africa was what is called here accommodation. Islam accommodates itself in such a way that it becomes a logical and natural aspect of its environment. If you think about it, even the times of the prayer, Fajr is correlated with with right before the sunrise. You think about Maghrib, sunset. So it's aligning itself with the natural aspects of the environment, as one example. Islam did not demand a violent break with the immediate past. In fact, it had many points of contact, offering immediate values, but without displacing the old ones. Thus, the form in which the African first encountered Islam was not removed from the past. So there was a connection from what you're doing currently, and what is expected or what you are exploring or learning about in Islam. And then the agents of Islam were Africans who integrated themselves into village life through intermarriage and becoming local traders, artisans, healers, medical practitioners who were accessible. what I mean here by accessible, there wasn't a hierarchy of non-accessibility. Wasn't a separation. They embedded themselves, so they're teaching and doing their work at the same time amongst the community. And then the mosques were simple and sometimes mobile, lending themselves to cultures accustomed to a nomadic lifestyle.
Yeah. This thing goes slow.
Shall I continue?
Yes, please.
All right. And then looking at some of the some additional pictures that kind of speaks to that. This picture at the top is taken from the Senegal Salampa desert, and there's and then here you can see just tents set up. There's another there's a mosque here, building shown. It's near a beach, actually the shore, and very simple building, just with prayer rugs inside. Is that, one moment here. And what was very interesting too, if you look on the far right, where my pointer is, this is actually also in the Lombok Desert. And this was actually an area that's being birded and that's being grown. This is being grown by some of the Fulanis. And what arrangement occurs is that they talk with the village chief and they get permission to actually plant and spend time in that area. There were some Fulanis were nomadic, but as was being mentioned at the time, that some of them were staying around a little longer in certain areas. They were given rights to plant and live. And then religious values. Islam becomes a vital cohesive force in the African social, political, and economic system, thus giving real meaning to the whole structure. Islam's most obvious signs and ritual prayers, adopting the lunar calendar, especially the communal ones, its death ceremonies, holidays, and its taboos attracted the local community. And then the concept of the jinn resonated with some African indigenous animists, who's defined as individuals believing in the existence and presence of innumerable spiritual beings concerned with human affairs and capable of helping or harming human interests. And then clerics, very strong component. Even though they form a new religious class, are not members of a priestly caste. They are at one and the same time the teacher, the guide, the trader, the artisan, the local medicine man, which appeals to the local people. And I'm going to give you a contrast story to what I just said. This is called the story, I'm calling it the story of Philip Kwok. And this is, moving on, this is going to Christianity. There was a character whose name is Philip Kwok, and this was the Portuguese that come into Congo. And I'll just read some of this and then explain a little bit more. A case study of Fonte, African elite, ordained into the Anglican priesthood. Kwok, it was located in the Cape Coast, located in Ghana. So as an elite, as a child from an elite family, Kwok was very familiar with the regular scene of scores of African captives being led through Cape Coast to the fortified castle. Castle meaning the slave castles were also called forts. Those were very interesting. They were basically corporate headquarters for enslaved, for the enslavement process. And I don't have any pictures here, but generally, what was very interesting about them is they had dungeons underneath, and at top were all the offices. There were offices, business as usual, where you had underneath those businesses or underneath those floors were actually dungeons where the enslaved were housed. So Kwok was aware that they were all, he noticed that, of course, that all these captives he was seeing as this child of an elite family, they started to notice that racial blackness, in other words, was already an active and central formation of the Atlantic regimes of slavery, religion, empire, and commerce that superseded the ethnic or national identities of Africans. And this is what anyone's telling him, It's just by sheer observation. So he ends up being recruited by a British missionary of the Society for the Propagation or Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts, SPG. And then another person, Cujo Kabusir, is African elite. And Kwok actually leaves the coast, his home, and he's immersed for 11 years in British society and Anglican Christianity. He returns, he marries a European woman. He returns, and it's a very interesting story. He tries to indoctrinate the African residents of the Cape Coast. He establishes a school at the Castle Fort for mixed race youth, and acts as a chaplain, get this, for the spiritual needs of slave trading officials. And it's very interesting. Of course, he could well, it was very interesting. He actually forgot some of the language while he was away for those 11 years. So it was very difficult. There was a communication barrier because he could not understand them and they could not understand some of what he was saying as well. So you imagine this, you're trying to propagate Christianity, but people can't understand what you're saying. And then he had disdainment for them. And they knew that. So he considered them to be infidels, he considered them to be, pagan. So there was this relationship, this antagonistic relationship that produced, that was created between him. At one point, he even started offering alcohol or spirits to the people to entice them to come. And some of them did come, but it was a failure. And the reason I bring this up is just to show you the nature of how Christianity in this particular region operated and why it wasn't popular amongst the natives, so to speak, or the native inhabitants. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about Edward Blyden. Imam Fahim mentioned Edward Blyden last week. But he has some very interesting comments related to Arabs and Africans. He indicated had been in communication prior to the rise of Islam in West Africa. So another, again, a reason for the spread of Islam in West Africa is that because the Arabs and the Africans had already intermingled for centuries way before pre-Islamic times. So I just want to read a little bit from this. The Arab missionaries, quote unquote, whom we have met in the interior. And this is Blyden, or either in this comment, he traveled. Blyden, let me just say a little bit about him. Edward Blyden was an African man. He was a Black man. He was from the Caribbean. And superior intelligence beyond his cohorts. And he was a Presbyterian minister. And in fact, he's called the first father of African nationalism. And it's very interesting reading his comments, his stories, etc., because you almost forget that you're talking, that a Christian is the one who's talking. It sounds like, because he's pro-Islam in many, many ways, or he's being very, very honest. And for that reason, he's an outsider to Islam, but he's in some way an insider because he is, African. So this is some of the comments that he's made. He said that Mohammedanism found its Negro converts at home in a state of freedom and independence of the teachers who brought it to them. When it was offered to them, they were at liberty to choose for themselves. The Arab missionaries whom we have met in the interior, as he would travel with a team or congregation of other members of the Presbyterian Church, they go without purse or script and disseminate their religion by quietly teaching their Quran. The native missionaries, Mandingos, and Fulas unite with the propagation of their faith, active trading. Wherever they go, they produce the impression that they are not preachers only, but traitors. But on the other hand, that they are not traitors merely, but preachers. And in this way, silently and almost unobtrusively, they are causing princes to become obedient disciples and zealous propagators of Islam. Their converts, as a general thing, become Muslims from choice and conviction and bring all the manliness of their former condition to the maintenance and support of their new creed. I'm going to go on and say a bit more. When the religion was first introduced, it found the people possessing all the elements and enjoying all the privileges of an untrammeled manhood. They received it as giving them additional power to exert an influence in the world. It sent them forth as the guides and instructors of their less favored neighbors and endowed them with the self-respect which men feel who acknowledge no superior. While it brought them a great deal that was absolutely new and inspired them with spiritual feelings to which they had before in utter strangers, it strengthened and hastened certain tendencies to independence and self-reliance to which were already at work. Their local institutions were not destroyed by the Arab influence introduced. They only assumed new forms and adopted themselves to the new teachings. In all thriving Mohammedan communities in West and Central Africa, it may be noticed that the Arab superstructure has been superimposed on a permanent indigenous substructure, so that what really took place when the Arabs met the Negro in his own home was a healthy amalgamation and not an absorption of an undue repression. I'd like to go on, and that's the part about the Mohammedanism found Africans in home at a state of freedom and independence. I'd like to say a little bit more about the absence of images, especially European representations of humans, prophets, and God. And I also want to mention that W.D. Muhammad, at one point in his life or his teachings, had I think it was a campaign against ridding religion of images. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that part. One moment. Pardon me for being a little bit disorganized right now. I have a lot of notes and I didn't. I highlighted them, but I didn't separate them. Okay, yeah, so Mohammedanism in Africa, instead of being treated in the offhand and contemptuous manner adopted by some who seem to have gathered all their knowledge of the religion from the Arabian Nights, ought to be approached with earnestness and respect, for there is much in it which Christians may profitably study and from which they might glean important lessons. Christians have something at least to learn from Mohammedans, which will make them not less but more Christian than they were before. And that's one of the comments made. The attempt to Europeanize the Negro in Africa will always be a profitless task. This is the feeling of the most advanced minds of the race. If it were possible, which happily it is not, to civilize and Christianize the whole of Africa. And I just want to say that Blyden, he did show tendencies. There were certain, he did show signs of a negativity, I could say, to pagan Africans. So this is what he's referring to there. So he's talking about Christianize the whole of Africa according to the notions of some Europeans. Neither would the people themselves or the outside world be any great gainers by it? Or the African would then fail of the ability to perform his specific part in the world's work as a distinct portion of the human race. The warnings of history on this subject are numerous. And I'm not finding the piece that I had, but I just want to mention that what Biden mentioned was the idea of the images of a white God, of white prophets, white, that was being forced into, and he's talking in relative to English-speaking countries where Africans were, that it was an injustice, and that what it caused is that the African could not see him or herself in these images, and what it did was actually contribute to the demise of their self-esteem, their self-confidence, etc. And I'm unfortunately not saying it as he did. And then lastly, there was nothing in the color of race of the African to prevent him, her from the highest privileges, social or political, to which any Muslim could attain. There is to say, no caste system. So that was another important factor in the spread of Islam in West Africa. And I conclude here. Thank you, and I hope you have some benefit from this. And please forgive any information that I omitted or in my presentation. Thank you.
Allahu Akbar. And I want to thank you for suffering through all the interruptions that we represented in the course of this. Wonderful. Appreciate it very, very much. Thank you. And also, Nosizwe will be accepting any questions that you may have regarding her or my presentation as we go forward. There are 3x5 cards that you're going to receive. If there's any questions live, since we're positioned the way that we are in here, you can ask those questions now while she's still here with us. All right. We're going to trade places and make a switch out right here. Thank you so much.
Alhamdulillah.
Another thing that I didn't get to say is that these fixed arrangements, they don't apply tonight. So anybody wants to move forward, you can take any of those chairs in the black, put in the black. Well, yes, that'll be fine, Velo, because when the slides present, they're just so much of a blur. So if you're closer, you get the benefit of that. Or if you're on any of the social medias, I understand that Facebook is not showing. We'll go ahead and take yours. Nosizwe, you can take yours. YouTube is good, so you'll be able to get the piece on YouTube and everything. But if you want to see a little better here in house, then I encourage you to move up. Otherwise, use your phone and get on these platforms that we are on. What's happening on the other is that our is going to sleep. Nosizwe, know that you are on camera, okay?
I can't turn it off. It's off on my computer.
No.
Oh, the other format.
Yeah. This is one of you to be aware.
Oh, this is his? Oh, this is yours. You're off here. This is where you're on.
Sorry.
It's StreamYard. Where
Adjustments.
you on the StreamYard studio? Where you were a guest, where he sent you the guest list. This one. Yeah. So now I'm on there too. So stop camera.
Okay. You want me to add you to the stage, Haja, or no? Okay. I tried. It's normally by pulling up the participants or the chat and then saying it's not sure. Come on up. Hey, look, I ain't fronting on nobody. Look, hey, we don't know what's happening right away. We just don't know what's happening right away. Welcome to real pancakes. You know what I'm saying? And not them perfectly round, crusty pancakes you get out the freezer, right? You know, my food analogies are gonna keep coming.
That's how you know you
Right
finished
now. That's right.
Oh, it's Zoom.
It's this one. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Excuse me.
So we're gonna go here.
Okay, I'm trying to get to
Three
share.
buttons and make co-host.
Where did you go?
The three buttons here.
Okay, that's what I wasn't seeing all the time because it was in presentation mode.
All right.
Right?
So, all right.
All right, what's next? Share. I know that's my DNA screaming back there. However, I know that's my DNA screaming back there. However, we want to, and I need to share on Zoom too. If it's better, slide the door closed and do that. Let's see. I'm trying to, what's going on? I need to close, make this smaller. Okay. We have to use two computers. Okay. Bismillah. I do believe we're ready. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. Again, brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum. I thank Nosizwe for her presentation and follow-up and for being along for this ride. We look forward to hearing more from her. A lot of my presentation tonight is because I've benefited from her very deep research in the course of the subject matter that we're addressing. So to begin with, there's like 5 segments to this. Whether we're going to cover them all in these limited weekends, mashallah. There it goes: the rise, the robbery, the rise, the robbery, the redemption, the resurrection, the Renaissance. Those 5 I'm using, and each one of them I've segmented off as a particular part of our whole journey. And I want you to all know, and I have a real strong sense of the intelligence that is focused here, and that is the reality of a master narrative. More and more and more of us, we have an idea about it, but we have to become more conscious of it and more deliberately intending to create and embrace that master narrative that really makes us, open quotes, a people. Because everyone and every group or whatever that is identified and can be identified as a people, they have a master narrative. And it's about understanding that master narrative. And I believe that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done for, in, and to, by, and through Bilalians, all we need to do is just understand the story, read the story, live the story, promote the story, and even though we use that language, story, it is the truth, and so we just got to move on. So right now, the segment that we're on is the robbery. So let's just simply continue with that. What we're going to cover as time permits today is revisit a little bit of the historical context of Africa and al-Islam, which Nosizwe has done an excellent job in adding to that. I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that we've already touched on. Then we'll move on to the transatlantic slave trade, and then from there to the global effort to make a slave race, and from that to differentiating between chattel and traditional slavery, and then also to touch on the cultural and spiritual impact of the whole enterprise, and also to introduce the beginning for African-American Muslims and al-Islam in America. This is, okay, I'm muted. Let's do this. Okay, so I don't know how much you missed, but you'll catch it in time. MashaAllah. Too many moving parts here, right? So alhamdulillah. But basically what I did just say is this what you're looking at now is basically the menu for the night, the outline, the schedule. We hope to cover this material. I'll restate it. Revisit the brief historical context of Africa and al-Islam, the transatlantic slave trade, the global effort to make a slave race, and also differentiating between chattel and traditional slavery, and also cultural and spiritual impact, and concluding tonight, inshallah, with an introduction to the beginning for African-American Muslims and al-Islam in America. That's our plan. With Allah's help, we'll be able to accomplish that. So when we spoke of the rise and the excellent material that Nosizwe brought to us with regard to Edward Blyden, the only thing that we pointed out last week was the fact that he makes this statement that the Muslims, they would establish schools, distribute books and education, mosques, trade, and intermarriage, and that the conquest of al-Islam with arms was impossible because the Sudanese and the Negritians were too powerful and had historically combated Arabs and Europeans. So it's like, no, you weren't going to fight your way into dominance over us. It's like, that ain't happening. And so this proclivity, this predisposition that the Africans had, towards al-Islam is evident in the way that it spread. Also, the historical waves of al-Islam, as they spread in Africa, we pointed out that predisposition is what led to this very notably uncharacteristic move of al-Islam on the continent, which was a top-down movement as opposed to bottom-up. And so when we look at the growth of the great African nations and kingdoms, from just being nations or kingdoms into empires, and which took place, again, no caste system, no imperialism. They took place by the movement first, by and from the leaders. Nosizwe's commentary included princes becoming followers of the quote unquote the clerics, of the teachers of Islam. And it is a beautiful understanding also is that they moved. Speaking of the Muslims, from her quotation, the way that the Muslims moved amongst them is that they move so much like a teacher. They move so much that they're like teachers who happen to be businessmen. And then they move so much like businessmen. They were businessmen who happened to be clerics or teachers. It's like, you know, they were indistinguishable in a manner of speaking. Okay, well, are you a businessman or are you a preacher? Are you a preacher or are you a businessman? And so that tone is very important. So that's how, you know, the trade itself and the way they did business and the integrity that came with that, and the spirituality, all of this is going to be new to the continent. And so in consequence, that day-to-day interaction led to that kind of reputation. And that kind of reputation was embraced by the leaders and the nobles first, and then the military, and then the masses, and finally the neighboring nations. So the beautiful spread of al-Islam was through the nature of integrity and trust that Muslims carry. The growth of these great kingdoms, we pointed out, obviously, as we said, we're not trying to cover every detail. So in the larger picture, you get Songhai, you get Mali, you get Ghana, etc., and of course the outstanding states of Timbuktu and Gao. The idea is that these all evolved in this manner. All of these evolved in this manner. And as a postscript, we point out that in African societies, the economic value of a person was well established, and the wealth and the power of the kingdom was measured in terms of human energy. And this led to the accumulation of personal wealth and power by acquiring more clients and slaves, which in turn extended the power of the rulers over the neighbors and beyond. The purpose of wars was to increase the power and the wealth of a kingdom, and by increasing its human power, diminishing that of its rivals. Additionally, the growth of trade and international trade led to the consideration of selling people in exchange for commodities, especially when foreign merchants were interested in acquiring slaves. For example, for over 200 years, powerful kings in what is now the country of Benin captured and sold slaves to the Portuguese, French, and British merchants. The slaves were usually men, women, and children from rival tribes, gagged and jammed into boats bound for Brazil, Haiti, and the United States. So when we speak to the transatlantic slave trade, and again, I want to say that is, you coming, what am I missing? The slides aren't moving. Okay, so this thing goes to sleep on us. Got it. All right. So this is where we are right now. Yeah. So just give me a thumbs up from back there if you when it's not switching. And I got to do what I got to do. Mashallah. All right. So this transatlantic slave trade network. This is just a generated image, but the image is to say that the world was involved in this. The world was involved in that. It's just people coming in and eating Africa and Africans in the course of building their empires. So the transatlantic slave trade unfolded as a grim web, ensnaring continents in a network of forced displacement and commodification. This vast enterprise linked Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a dark nexus of trade and human suffering. And we hear the words right now, very prominent in the news, human trafficking, right? So the human trafficking, which was in the millions at that time, and we still have in the world that we're in right now, this human trafficking. So I don't know why this thing is not changing the way that it should. So it means every time I'm going to have to. I think there must be a setting on the projector that causes that not to switch up. Mashallah. All right. So, with regard to the Middle Passage and its harrowing conditions, a harrowing journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage was an abyss of human suffering, a testament to the cruelty inflicted upon the captured. In the ship's hull, the shackled endured unimaginable conditions stripped of their humanity. And I think that many of us have heard the stories and part of those stories. And so the Portuguese are, of course, central to the whole thing. Portugal began the European slave trade with Africa, and Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, sent a trading expedition to Africa in 1441. By 1444, a cargo of 235 enslaved Africans had been brought to Portugal. And this is a critical part of this whole thing, is this maritime exploration. There was this well, it's called the Age of Exploration, right? The Portugal pioneered the seas with caravels, these type of boats that you're seeing right there, caravels, charting new courses that would regrettably map the future of transatlantic human trafficking. Their quest for exploration marked the inception of an era that commodified human lives for labor. So it's like that was the oil of that age in terms of how you get your engines running, how you make your things happen. It's not oil like it is now, and even when you talk about computer chips. But at that time, it was all about bodies. It was about black bodies and slaves, quote unquote. So a large part, some of the names that you're about to see right here are some of the big names in that age of exploration. And that is, of course, we all know Christopher Columbus, right? And Vasco da Gama, Portugal, 1498. John Cabot, I think it's Cabot or Cabot that we would say, again, operating for England, 1497. Ferdinand Magellan, we've heard his last name is like one of those before Prince and Madonna, one of those one-name persons. Magellan, that's you hear Magellan and you know what you're talking about. Though he was Portuguese by birth, he was operating for Spain. So these are guys just like truckers, right? You have truckers that say, I drive for so-and-so. It's like I take shipments from here to there to here. These guys were the slavers and the explorers that are operating on something we're going to hear a little more about right now. Cortez, operating for Spain, 1519 to 1521. Pizarro, another name that we should, I think, familiar with, operating again for Spain in early 16th century, 1532-31. Jacques Cartier, operating for France. So you see who's in the game. You have the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the British. These are the ones. All right. So everybody had their team that would go into Africa and go into those places. We're going to learn more about the rest of those places and go get them and bring them back so that we can do what we have to do. So the genesis of the transatlantic slave trade coincides with the doctrine of discovery, which was issued by the Catholic Church of the 15th century. This new doctrine gave Christian explorers the right to claim lands they discovered and lay claim to those lands for their Christian monarchs. That's the king and the church. They saying, go get them, go get them. And so they had a doctrine, and the Pope issued his bull, was a papal bull. I think that's a Jacobite laughing at him. So every decision y'all make is bull. But we're the ones that's running the thing. You know, we talk about Jacobite before this, not tonight, but another time. So discovered and laid claim to those lands for their Christian monarchs, like Ferdinand and Isabel. Any land that was not inhabited by Christians was available to be, quote, discovered, unquote, claimed and exploited. The world is ours. The name for that process is dum diversas. It means until different. This was the name of the papal bull we just talked about, issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452. It granted Portugal the authority to attack, conquer, and subjugate non-believers and enemies of Christ, including Saracens and pagans. Saracens, I believe, is the general name that's used in so many history books for Muslims. Saracens and pagans. It authorized the reduction of these individuals to perpetual servitude and the appropriation of their lands and possessions by the King of Portugal and his successors. Wow. This is really, I mean, what kind of mind do you have to have? What kind of heart do you have to have? What kind of, idea do you have to have about yourself to think that you have a right to the rest of the world and everybody in it and everything that they live upon to say it's ours? Some haven't gotten over that yet, but that's what it is. So, to speak of making the making of a slave race, Genesis 9:24-25, it says, so Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son Ham had done unto him. Then he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. So since the 15th century, and this is a book that's often referred to by many researching the subject, the curse of Ham, race, is that, I can't see the final of it. As it relates to the history, it has its connection with the history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Since the 15th century, religious leaders have cited these verses, this passage, as the justification for the slavery of all African people. For almost 500 years, priests taught their flocks that a Hebrew prophet had condemned millions of Africans to slavery because they were descended from Ham's son, Canaan. The curse of Ham thus formed the core religious justification for the transatlantic slave trade. So that is deeply rooted. That is the slave trade that we know of in our history is deeply rooted in the religious ideals of the perpetrators. This is Jonathan A.C. Brown, and this is a quote relating to the idea of what Islam has to do with it. We know there's no apology coming from us for as far as the behavior of those people call them Arabs, call them Muslims, what have you, there. But the way that they were involved in the slave trade before even the chattel slave started, we dealt with that last week, is that yes, there was involvement, but again, slavery, the slavery of the type that we're speaking of, was the slavery of the era, the slavery of the age. Slavery was the way that things were done, and for many different reasons. You had debt slaves, you had criminals, you had those who were in wars that were lost, etc. That was how it went from the Greeks to the Romans to the Africans to it's just in the history of man. So the eradication of, quote unquote, we can call it that, the eradication of slavery as a means of economic growth, development, or what have you. You can just look at the parable of John Henry and the steam engine. That parable, John Henry and the steam engine, is a parable of the displacement of slavery as an economic engine by the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine changed the issue of the need for slaves, became a whole different thing. But before that, during the agricultural age, was slaves and bodies. That's what was needed. But when you start getting to, the industrial age, internal combustion engine, even the cotton gin and the like, that starts changing the whole landscape for as far as the behavior is concerned. Oh, but that Muslims / and Arabs, and also these kingdoms. When you talk about Songhai, Ghana, Mali, Kenan, Bornu, these other African nations and empires, they had slaves too. And they made slaves also from wars, and they sold slaves as well as a part of this drive for all the reasons that we read just before. Sort of like many times it's kind of like, I need to get this tribe and get these people out of my hair, so y'all take them with you. But Jonathan A.C. Browning says, there's no denying that anti-Black sentiment is rampant among many Muslims. This is indefensible. This is a fact. But if this were a problem with Islam, another very, very, very beautiful quote that Nosizwe gave from Dr. Blyden on what happens when the Africans were met in their homes by Muslims, when meaning that in quote unquote, in their land, in their native circumstance and environment, there wasn't an imposition of Islam upon them. The Islam, as we talked about the Crystal River that Dr. Abdullah Farouk gives that model of Islam being like a crystal river, and whatever bedrock it passes over, it takes on the shade, it takes on the color of the bedrock. So when it passed over China, it looked Chinese. When it passed over Africa, it looked African. When it passed into Europe, it looked European, etc. So that's the nature of Islam. The nature of Islam is that it purifies, purges any culture of what is obscene relative to the human being and to the destiny that Allah has for them. That's what Al-Islam does. But it's also important to understand, and I'm going to go back to his quote, it's also important to understand that ideas are not responsible for the people who claim to adhere to them. Ideas are not responsible for the people who claim to adhere to them. So when we read in the documents for America's founding, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These statements were made by many of them slaveholders. They were holding slaves at the moment they were saying it. Doesn't mean that the idea was not the right idea and true. It just means that the ones who were espousing the idea were not true to the ideas that they were espousing, because they were denying the very humanity of the people that those slaveholders were holding in slavery. All right, so the same thing applies to wherever you find Muslims, anywhere on the planet, at any time. Islam is perfect, but people are not. I've heard that said. Islam is perfect, but people are not. Dave Chappelle Muslim. He did in an interview with the other day, whatever, he's got all kind of beard and stuff now, whatever his name is. Y'all know who he is. So he talked about finding out Islam in a pizza shop, Dave Chappelle. And so he turned to Islam, became to Islam, he was 17 years old, etc. And so if you know Dave Chappelle at all, you know about his acts, his performance, and the ever-present Sammy Davis Jr. cigarette, or what have you, in his act. I think it was Sammy Davis Jr. that always had a cigarette when he was in there. So the laugh and in the interview that he was having with the other Dave, he said, I didn't say I was good at it, right? So it's like, yeah, I'm a Muslim, but I didn't say I was good at it. And so that happens throughout the history, even now. It's like, there are Muslims who are Muslims, but sometimes we're not good at it. And in consequence of that, there's behavior that Islam gets blamed for that's not Islamic behavior. It's the behavior of that individual, but people don't make that separation in that. And so Dr. Brown is saying here, he says, but if this were a problem, meaning that, so you have these indefensible things that are done by Muslims, right? And those things actually, the wrong things that are done, I mean, unless they're absolutely, whoever they are, crazy people, literally, they don't do them even in the name of Islam. They do them, they're Muslim, but they don't even do those wrong things in the name of Islam. It's just wrong things that they're doing. So that's the fault of the actor. Not the way of life. But of course, we know modern press doesn't make that separation also at all, right? Going on with Dr. Brown's statement, he says, but if this were a problem with Islam, that is, if Islam is what promoted that indefensible behavior, if it was in the religion, right? Horrible, horrible, horrible. It is something that you can't unsee once you see it. So in the context of the caste system, the movie Origin, or I don't know if it's Origins or Origin, when they talk about the Dalits, and they actually show these Dalits who have to go behind the others who are higher than them on the caste system hierarchy, and actually, dive into their feces to clean it out. This is happening real time, even as we speak, because that's their lot in life based on the Hindu caste system. And you're a Dalit, you're untouchable, right? So that's part and parcel of the religion that creates and puts people in those conditions. So when you see wrong done by Muslims, it's not the religion that is dictating that wrong behavior. It's the individual that's dictating that's doing that wrong thing. And again, the doctor's statement is that if there was a problem with al-Islam, then it would be uniquely pronounced in Muslim communities, and it is manifestly not. It's not. Racial prejudice and structurally racist things, systems, etc. That's not part and parcel of al-Islam. Al-Islam doesn't construct worlds like that, but people who call themselves Muslims do and may. But again, it's indefensible, as the doctor says. So, man, it hasn't changed for a long time. Huh? Let's see here. I gotta catch up. I'm gonna have to check the settings on this because we shouldn't go to sleep just like that all the time. Anyway, moving on. This is Dr. Muhammad Ali. He, in his paper, The Negro in Afro-Arabian Muslim Consciousness, he said, only when a society's internal structures are discriminatory and its ideology justifies such discrimination, meaning that that's your society, Your society is grounded in that. It says only when you have these structures that are discriminatory, and in society whose ideology justifies such discrimination, can that society be considered racist? You all got laws and rules, just like the Dalits and the caste system, etc. And we are in a caste system. Okay, okay, you're racist if it's based on race, and whatever that is on the Untouchables. I don't even know if you can call it race. It's just a caste system because they're all the same race, but the structure itself. These are two books that I bring out, and if you really want more of Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents, is a must read if you want to own the understanding and the receipts for, yes, this is a caste system, right? Read her book. These two, this is the one that's by Baradaran, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. She just researches and traces the whole history that there are positively constructive, when I say constructive, meaning deliberately built barriers by law and so many other means to make sure that blacks did not have any money that constituted in any kind of way a threat to the existing system or the intention to keep them in quote unquote their place. And so this is the drawing of the explicit acts and moves on the part of the quote unquote the financial system, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, in America, is to keep blacks broke. Bottom line, keep blacks broke. So The Color of Money is a must read in that respect. And then also The Color of Law, which is by Richard Rothstein, and showing again the history of law, how law deliberately, how, you talk about things like Plessy, it escapes the Plessy versus what? Is the Supreme Court? In any case, it was a Supreme Court case. So Brown, Plessy versus Ferguson, right. Brown versus Board of Education, different things like that, where all of these different circumstances that instantiated as law this discrimination, this racism structurally, right? There's a saying in one of his name is Dr. Amos Brown, where he it's black on black violence. I'm trying to think of the title of the book. In any case, he points out that law is interest in the form of legislation. Law is interest in the form of legislation. So that means if I put a legislator in office, then he's to represent my interest. And he represents my interest, and he carries out my interest, and he acts in my interest by the legislation that he brings into the books, into law. So these laws, they follow the people who are representing their constituency. And 2010 was very, very important, real serious turning point when the whole making equational, meaning the corporate one vote, one man, one vote, that the corporate was a person and you and I are individuals, and so you're equal. So the corporation can spend their money the way they want because they're acting in their personhood, in their own interests. So basically, how do you win against that. Why? How could it possibly be that your interests could ever be fully represented? But that's the world that we're in right now. The money that's still in the game and actually running the game. So just to touch a little bit on just outlining the inception of the European-led chattel slavery. So now we're starting to get to the transition from slavery as a historical feature of the world, such as it was at that time. Now we're talking 14th century, now 15th century. Now a new kind of slavery is operating on the backs of this age of exploration, right? The inception of European-led chattel slavery, specifically transatlantic slave trade, began in the early 15th century with the Portuguese initiating the first slave voyages from Africa to the Americas in 1526. 1441, the Portuguese slave trade begins. The Atlantic slave trade began 1444. Traders brought the first large number of slaves from Africa to Europe. 1451, slave trade system organization. The Portuguese purchased slaves from a North African Berber that becomes the Arab Muslim, who in turn acquired slaves from the African rulers in exchange for horses. The local technology had not yet outgrown the slavery system as it had in the West. Now, this is a quote in part from Dr. Ali Mazrui, rahimahullah, and he's talking about that now when you begin to see the blow up of the meaning the magnification of the role of the Arabs in the slave trade. The way there is this is beyond 1506. The condition was that you may know that slavery was outlawed in Europe before it was outlawed in America. And a part of it has to do with the birth of the industrial age. And the birth of the industrial age called for the exploitation of trade routes that had been established on the continent of Africa. So when you understand how massive the continent is, and when you understand I'm going to call it the footprint that was left by Muslims, those Muslims that met the Africans in their homes and that the trade routes and the network of trade routes that were being built in the trans-Saharan, what's called trans-Saharan trade route. That's in country in this massive 10,000 nation state landmass called Africa. And we talked about how many of the continents, including China and the entire United States of America, and Indonesia, India, etc., all could be put into, and I'm leaving somehow, all could be put into New Zealand, Australia, can be put on the continent of Africa and still have some room left. However, the Muslim connection, and yes, that Arab connection, because there was the expansive life of the trade of Muslims is stamped on the Quran in the verse لِإِلَافِ قُرَيْشِ إِلَافِهِمْ رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ. So it's saying by the love and the affiliation of the Quraysh, who are the premier and were the premier tribe of al-Islam in its origins. They were traders, they were business people, dare I say, just for analogy, you have the Rothschilds, right? You have the Rothschilds, supposedly, I don't know, 4 or 6 brothers. I don't know how many there were, but so much of their wealth is still with us right now, distributed in their families, etc. But the Rothschilds in this, even in and around this shipping activity in the industrial and the birth of the industrial age, they began to build their wealth, and they had their network their economic network that they had built. So that was a powerful network. So, but the same was for the Quraysh. The Quraysh had done the same on the Arab Peninsula, and then as Al-Islam spread across North Africa, and again, East and South Africa, meaning going south, then that same skill set for establishing trade routes and connections, and that was also what was coming with them as they went there. And so when you start talking about the 7th century, which was the time that it's got started, around, let's go ahead, 8th century. So you got 8th century, and now what we're speaking of now is like 500, 600 years later, right? So so the kind of network, some of you may have had an ant farm maybe sometime in your life, but one of those you remember those little things. You could clearly see that you got the ants and you put sugar in or whatever, and the ants just go digging, making their burrows, etc. And so they build a whole network, a whole world in that little ant farm. Okay, well, look at the continent of Africa and the spread of Islam in the same way, and think about the infrastructure of trade, education, and travel that was established by the Muslims before this got started. That's the Trans-Saharan network. But since that Trans-Saharan network belonged to, quote unquote, the Muslims, who are, whether they be Arabs or Africans, there were empires. We already talked about the empires, Songhai, Mali, Ghana, etc. All those are in that area where the trade networks and everything's happened. The movement back and forth for Hajj, for example, 5 centuries of Hajj going from West Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and Mecca. It's like there was a big network. So now these Europeans who got another program going on said, we need to take this. We need to take this. We don't need to be paying no tariffs or nothing. We need to take this. And so that's where their move was. So a big part of the stealing and the robbery of Africa, and also the denigration of Arabs and Muslims in conjunction with that, was upon the back of the new burgeoning industrial era, which needed the trade networks of the trans-Saharan economies, right? And so therefore, we need to get rid of these Arabs. So we need to start a propagation campaign, a propaganda campaign, so we can get rid of them. So that's very important to understand. Now, for as far as the idea of there being some slavery in that in those Arab quarters, and also on the East African side of the continent, it has to do with that traditional slavery was still going on because the industrial technology had not grown there, so they were still using the old technology / slaves, and not the new technology of industry, quote unquote. And so therefore, that was another way by which they can continue to put that label on the Arabs as doing that, because they had not evolved beyond getting things done through slavery. So that's a big part of it. And also, the slave trade system was well organized. Portugal played a significant role in the European slave trade with Africa, establishing colonies and engaging in the transatlantic slave trade. Lisbon was a major port involved in the Portuguese slave trade, sending enslaved Africans to Brazil and other destinies. So European demand for labor coincided with these vulnerabilities in Africa, where economic incentives, political rivalries, and existing trade networks could be exploited to supply the Atlantic slave trade. African elites and traders benefiting from the sale of captives, people, is that making money? There's some people, whatever, Jew, Christian, Muslim, pagan, what have you, is he making money? There's some who say, well, let's go. And that was what was going on. African elites and traders benefiting from the sale of captives for European goods, including weapons, played a crucial role in sustaining the trade. This economic and political engagement contributed to the stabilization of certain African states at the expense of others, exacerbating internal conflicts and capture of slaves. So then this is also a part of, after the rise, there was the decline, and this was a large part of what was driving the decline on the continent. The combination of Europe's expanding economic interest in the Americas, the availability of African captives through existing and newly intensified systems of enslavement, and the technological and naval capabilities, the age of exploration, to transport large numbers of enslaved people across the Atlantic created the circumstances for the rise of Europe-led chattel slavery. And this form of slavery was distinct in its scale, duration, and the racial ideologies that developed around it, significantly impacting the histories of Africa, the Americas, and Europe. I hope that you're feeling and sensing that it was a global, cataclysmic, major matter in the history of humanity. It was nothing less than that. And there are probably better words for saying it. Chattel slavery in the southern United States, we're beginning to get to that now. The sprawling plantations of southern United States became the stage where captured Africans first endured the brutal reality of chattel slavery. Now we're on this side of the water. And existence reduced to property. Their forced labor underpinned the growth of an economy at the cost of their freedom and dignity. It's like we can imagine only in a small way the horrors. We can only imagine. Imagine that the reality of the moment that you are in, literally mortal danger in a totally foreign, strange land with monsters of quote unquote human beings who hold your existence in their hand. It's like, man, now imagine that for 300 years. It's really something. But that's a part of our master narrative. So on slavery, Fime Akomolafi, he said, speaking to the chattel slavery that was introduced by capitalism, differs from all other forms of slavery. This is why we can't even call when we have to by name. Okay, like use this a little bit. It's like when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we say he, but we know that Allah is not a man, he's not male nor female, but we say he because it's quote unquote more appropriate to speak to his power, etc. And that's a distinction that is a male-female distinction in principle here. But God is not a man, even though we use that term. And I'm trying to say that this thing that's called slavery, yeah, we were enslaved, we were slaves for whatever. No, we need another name. I don't know what it is. But right now, the main distinction to be made of it from it is, okay, we just call it chattel slavery. It's like chattel is cattle. It's really the same thing. You would just dehumanize to the point where you were just an animal. You were just an animal, herded and treated and raised and killed and slaughtered, just like any other draft animal or any other domesticated beast, literally. So we call it chattel slavery. But he says there's a fundamental difference between the African and the American concepts of slavery. In many African societies, slavery was not synonymous with racial inferiority. Slaves could assimilate into the owner's family, acquire property, and even ascend to high social status. It's certainly true in Al-Islam. I believe the Seljuks or the Mamluks were caliphs who were former slaves in the land. So they ascend to high social ranks and exemplified by Jaja of Opobo, unaware of the harsh reality. See, even when those kingdoms and those folks said, "Well, just get them out of here," here, take them with you. Yeah, we'll take that, and they go. So they had no idea of what they were sending them off to. Unaware of the harsh realities of American slavery, where dark skin was equated with being less than human and slaves were considered property for life, African traders initially did not have a grasp of the cruelty of the system they were feeding into. The revelation of these stark differences led figures like Madame Tinubu of Nigeria to renounce the slave trade and work against it as an abolitionist, recognizing the degradation of the institution of slavery by foreign practices and the profit-driven wars it incited, right? So again, you talk about those centuries and centuries of, again, wars and slaves from wars, etc., and then empire, to the extent that empire is benefited by that slavery, that so-called traditional slavery, and not therefore knowing what they were sending the people into, and so it continued until it became more known that, excuse me, this is what you're actually doing. So when you speak of traditional slavery was not based on race. It includes whites, domestic work, soldiers, meaning that's the roles that they would play. And yet they were still seen as persons, not the property of the master. Manumission, that is freedom, buying your freedom, was possible in traditional slavery. But in chattel slavery, your enslavement was based on your race. It didn't include whites, and they were solely for profit, total dehumanization. The property of the master, you were the property of the master, and manumission was not possible. Once a slave, always a slave in that system. Inshallah, to move to cultural and spiritual consequences, hopefully I ticked on the share with sound. I want to play a clip from Imam Mohammed on this, so let's see what happens. Anybody hearing anything? Yes or no?
And how the mighty will of God, the mighty
Are you hearing it from me?
For the human soul.
Yeah, I'm hearing it, brother.
Okay.
It works in us while we are asleep, when we don't know it. Now, I didn't know.
Huh?
Jonah didn't know.
Okay. He's talking about Jonah. This is the story of Jonah. Imam Muhammad is giving us an interpretation of it, how it relates to this.
And present and aware of everything in your circumstances. And God has willed that the human soul
How about Facebook and
be delivered
YouTube?
from all captivity and stand free.
I'm actually not playing it. We'd be behind.
God has willed that. So I know that God has been present in my life from the time I took the first breath every day. But I have to wait God's time. And God has his clock and we have our clock. I have to wait God's time. Thank God his time came for my soul to stand free before him, free of all captivity. And that's you too. Praise be to Allah. So much we need to review sometimes. We need to stop, and before we do the thing that we are eager to do or anxious to do, stop and count your blessings before you became in charge of the matter. Yes, Before we came into charge of the matter, God was helping us and with us and supporting us and blessing us and getting us closer and closer to the great meeting with Him. So when Jonah came upon that boat as a, what you call those guys that on the boat don't supposed to be on there? Stowaway. Thank you. The Imam doesn't have a script. Yes, I do. Don't you ever think that. I never come before you without a script. But I'm a free man. All right. Not even my script can hold me. If I want to walk off from the script, I'll do it. Yes. Don't ever think that God was not there. If God was with Jonah, to see him go where he's supposed to go, if we are lost, don't you know God is with us? And if we move from place to place, is God with us, causing us to go from place to place? Now, this is going to be a little hard on you. Yes, they came to Africa with the slave ships from Europe, and they loaded up the ship with merchandise. That was my mothers and fathers and your mothers and fathers. And some of our people had my mother or my father or both captive because they had wars, they had regional wars, and they had captives. And some of my people was glad to get rid of a person that they had captured in war. And sold me or my mother, not me personally, but my mother, my father, forefathers and mothers sold them to a slave trader. The slave trader brought them on the boat and brought them here, crossed the water. Many of them died, committed suicide, jumped overboard. But obviously, those of my parents, forefathers, were not thrown overboard because I'm here. They didn't die, I'm here. All right. If God had selected Jonah, and he's on the ship sleeping, why can't you accept that I say God selected my forefathers and mothers that were brought by ship to this land? And they were on the ship, and they were unaware too, like Jonah. They were unaware of their calling. They were unaware of their purpose. And they were thrown off the ship into slavery. And I guess that's worse than the fish. Thrown off the ship into slavery. They became even a worse captives now. Captives on the ship, not captives in slavery. They're going to have generations of miserable existence. Yes, that children are going to be born in that miserable condition and will know nothing else but what they're born into. If we can believe that God was with Jonah on the ship while he didn't know it, that God had selected him, and God was going to see him get where he's supposed to go, how come we can't believe that God was with us when our parents were on the ship and God was going to see that we get where we should go? God never punishes you for nothing. He never punishes you for nothing. The message of Islam came to Africa, and the Africans didn't respect it like they should have. And they suffered then, but even more, they're suffering now. They have no more dignity now, most of them, than we have on welfare. Us who are on welfare, getting a paycheck from the taxpayer, officially from our government. Huh? There's big nations over there in Africa, They're existing waiting on a paycheck. They're waiting on the assistance check to come from the industrial nation. This is their condition. We talk about Africa, great Africa. Where is great Africa? Where there's poverty and starvation, widespread, when there's no strong industry there. Egypt in Africa, under President Abdel Nasser, was able to produce their first automobile. What automobiles Africa produced? Can we send to Africa to get some whirly-derby washing machines, electric stoves or gas stoves? Can we call there and say we want so many school buses made for us? It'd be wonderful, wouldn't it? If we could call to Africa, now situation was financially good enough for us to call to Africa and say, we want motherland to send us to manufacture so many school buses for us, for our school system. We're going to use your school buses. We're going to call them Fez, Morocco school buses, or Timbuktu school buses. That would be wonderful, but we can't do that because they're on welfare too. They're deeply in debt to the Western powers, deeply in debt to the Western powers, and still got their hand out asking for more. They want assistance. You hear me? Wake up! Africa is on assistance. It has to have public aid from America, Europe, or some other industrial nation. So, yes, there are circumstances. They're being whipped for some reason. They're getting a spanking for some reason. Okay, so here we are in a bad situation on the slave ship. But we're our people, good people. Had they honored their calling? If they had, we would never been on the ship. Nobody would have seen, nobody would have looked at Africa and say, here's a place where we can get what we want. We would have been so strong in our excellence as servants of God, they would have never thought to come to us for slaves. So don't think we were innocent. But the human soul is innocent. The human soul is innocent. The mind goes astray. The soul always knows God. All it needs is an opportunity to have a chance to have a communication again with its Lord. And it will repent and it will go to its God. It's the head that interferes. See, while I'm talking, and some of you all interfering, I feel static in the lines of communication. Not many of you all, just a few of you out there doing that. And it ain't your soul that's doing that, it's your crazy head in the way of communication. If you just stop thinking about that stuff that messes up your mind, buddy, you'll be traveling real nicely with us. And believe me, this is the best trip I ever took. Oh, it's so wonderful to travel on the path of Allah. Oh, yes. Now, here we are in America in bad circumstances, and the proof that they captured the souls that belong to God, the proof of it is, while we were without knowledge, without education, without even the tongue to speak correct English, dumb, deprived slaves in the world sense. African-American slave woman. She had the courage to speak to the white uppity uppies. She said, you all look like God in your face. Now, where did she get that idea from? They gave her that idea, that the face of a human being looks like God. She said, you all look like God in the face, but you act like the devil in your heart. Along came others who said, we do not believe God wants this miserable condition for us. God is a God of love. God is a God of justice. Those were the protesters who protested the treatment that we were receiving. So here is here is Jonah now, waking up to his calling. And he's speaking, risking his life. He might be lynched, he might be shot, he might be burned at the stake. He's risking his life to speak what he believes is the will of God for him. And many of them lost their lives. Yes, many of them lost their lives. They were killed for expressing their mind. But we're here. We are here. Their children. We're here in a new day. And we have made that 3 days journey. Praise be to Allah.
Alhamdulillah. Imam Mohammed. And so this is also, again, this is a part of the sign that Bilalian African American Muslims are. We are a sign, and we are a fulfillment of other stories, like the story of Joseph, who was thrown into the well by his brothers. You read that story. Yes. So in 12:15, Quran 12:15, where it says, so they did take him away, and they all agreed to throw him down the bottom of the well. And we put it into his heart, this message of a surety, you will one day tell them the truth of this affair while they don't know you. This is your story. This is your story. It's our story. And it's the fulfillment and the realization of it. So to visualize in time-lapse photography what happened in the history of Africa and the history of America to bring African-American Muslims in particular and Muslims in America in general to where they are in America today. Al-Islam came to Africa. Islamic empires rise up on the continent, and empires then decline. Then you have tribal wars, and then we have chattel slave trade. It begins. We have the Middle Passage with tens of millions of lives lost over centuries in the Atlantic slave trade. And we were kidnapped, and we were shipped, and we were stripped. Look at all these things that, they become so much of a cliche, but it's just a fact. It's like our names were taken from us, our languages were taken from us, our cultures were taken from us, our traditions taken from us, our religions, our history, our memories, etc. All that was a part of the stripping away that happened to that property after the Middle Passage and crossing the Atlantic. We were emasculated, and Imam Muhammad, I haven't heard it better said than by anyone, that this peculiar institution of slavery was an experimental clinic designed to cause us to dysfunction in the vital areas of our lives. MashaAllah, I have to restrain myself, because it's like when we start getting to the Negro, and that's what's coming up next, not tonight, but tomorrow, inshallah, we start getting it, we still suffer from what was done in that experimental clinic. Still suffer at all levels. Really important. Edward R. Embry in Brown Americans, 1946, has said, we have as far as possible closed every avenue by which light may enter into the slave's mind. If we could extinguish the capacity to see the light, so that's talking about the soul. So the soul is always innocent, and the soul is there. If we could just get a taste, right? So if we had the capacity, however, to extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work would be complete. They would then be on the level of a beast of the field, and we should be safe. That's another thing. Many of these Caucasians, mashallah, put back. I'm just giving history. I don't worry about Europeans, Caucasians, anything like that from any kind of emotional perspective. They're human beings that, such as they are. And that's fine. And everybody has to be judged on the basis of who they are and how they are, etc. But a part of it, this whole replacement theory, which is driving the Trump team in school, etc. That whole Frenchman put that together, and that's their local Yakub's history kind of thing. The great replacement theory. It's like they're trying to replace us, right? So we go back to the early part of this conversation and say that the discovery doctrine is like, yeah, we're supposed to be in charge of everything. Now here comes somebody talking about replacing us. That's the fear. The fear, hey, the position that we're in is the position that we're supposed to be in. We earned it. Yeah. Nobody has the right to take us out of this position. And there's a stone to the bone, very real ideology that again is driving campaigns like those of Donald Trump and his cohort, saying, the great replacement theory. They're trying to. Blacks are trying to replace us. The Asians are trying to replace us. The Mexicans are trying to replace us. We're not supposed to be replaced. It's crazy. It's crazy. And I'm telling you, come as we approach November, it's going to get crazy. Wallahi, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. But going to Imam's statement, that but the human soul is innocent. The mind goes astray. The soul always knows God. All it needs is an opportunity to have a chance. An opportunity is to have a chance to have a communication again with its Lord, and it will repent and it will go to its God if the head doesn't interfere. That's so very important. And so, mashallah, alhamdulillah, rabbil alameen, we've consumed what we intended. We thank Allah for His grace in doing so. Next part of the robbery, because the robbery ain't over, the next part of the robbery is the adaptation. If you have any questions, Nosizwe is ready to get those questions for you. The iftar is going to be around 7:30 or something like that, 7:25. And I submit, et cetera, that we'll 5 minutes after, whatever, if you have a phone that says sunset, which is sunset time X, Y, or Z, that's fine. But we're going to delay the call maybe like 5 minutes after that. You have questions?
I do. Would you prefer to just read them from the cards for reference, or do you want me to read them?
Again, you can go ahead and read them. I wish I had given you a mic before. Go.
All right. With all that we have gone through and are still existing, could we be considered the chosen people?
Okay, when we use that language, I'll need the mic. When we use that language, chosen people, it automatically brings in what goes with it, which is a claim that that the quote unquote people who identify themselves as Jews do. Chosen people I wouldn't endorse that take. I know there's another way. Chosen in the scheme of God, there is a choosing, but I think Allah says preferred when He says, I preferred you above nations X, Y, Z. So I think God has shown a preference to us, and I think this whole history is stating that. And there's so many attributes of our situation. That's why we're taking the time to do this as well, because it is clear from a view of history that the circumstance, even if you just think about the uniqueness of that experience, everything that we've said about how we started, how we got here, etc., is unique in the world. And the people that were made, when we get to this adaptation, the people there have never been a people like this people that were made. And again, there will never be another circumstance, not in this eon of the universe's existence. There will never be another quote unquote one made as the Negro was made. And for that reason, since Allah is never absent at any time or place, to that extent, Allah has favored us in a way that no one else has been favored, but we have also been challenged and oppressed and depressed like no one else. All that list of things that happened to us, it never happened to anybody else. So it's that uniqueness that does make it strong evidence for, and I embrace it, strong evidence that Allah has, quote unquote, chosen us, preferred us for a very particular task. And when we talk about the Renaissance, inshallah, we have a better understanding of that.
You might have answered this question already, but
Okay.
any additional comments? What is a chosen people or person?
Yeah, okay. Essentially, I'm saying I only reluctantly continue to entertain comments with that word. I don't prefer that word chosen because of the baggage that goes with the word, right? In fact, I did an Instagram post. So when somebody gets chosen, all right, so if you're chosen as the presidential candidate, then that's what you're chosen for. If you're chosen by the NBA, what have you, that's what you're chosen for. So if someone says, that they're the chosen people, then we got to ask ourselves, chosen for what? We're the chosen people. Okay, what are you chosen for? And are you doing what you were chosen for? And there's so much information on that. It's like these people that claim to be the chosen people are not doing anything like what Abraham, to whom they revert, it's saying that that's their claim, is grounded in Abraham. These people that make that claim, they're nothing like what Abraham charged and expected them to do. So let's go with a favored people, people preferred for this time. And mashallah, when we get further down the road, we show how that preference is showing up in us.
Were the North American Berbers Muslims?
North American? North
I'm
African?
sorry.
They mean African,
That's my
right?
mistake.
Okay, sorry.
What were the North African Berbers Muslims?
Yeah, Berber is just another name that is used for Muslims / Arabs in North Africa. Just round figures, just like they use the term Saracens. Whoever, it depends on who's speaking. When they say Saracens, they're talking about Muslims. And then Berbers, again, I would say same. And you can also feel free to contribute to this part of the conversation, okay?
The next question, what percentage of Africans were eventually enslaved? I am going to contribute to that one.
Yes.
I already posted something in the chat. It's a site called Slave Voyages. The estimate was about 12.5 million Africans were enslaved, but it's difficult to figure out the percentage, because if you are going to do the percentage, you got to know what the whole is. And I don't really think there was any data indicating what the entire population of countries from the African continent. I don't think that existed. So percentage, probably not possible to determine.
Okay.
Do you believe slavery can exist today?
Slavery does exist today. Right? So even when you talk about sharecropping or peonage and all those kind of things, just slavery, there are some things there's some circumstances that we may think people are really free. It's actually just a high level slavery for the 21st century. Yes, slavery definitely exists now. Yes.
Then a second question, what did the Nation of Islam do in Africa?
Let me have the mic. So what did the Nation of Islam do in Africa?
Do you want to expound on that a little bit? Yeah.
So are you thinking about Elijah Muhammad and Minister Farrakhan's Nation of Islam?
I don't know who really acted. I don't know who really went after.
Yeah, no, we did as the Nation of Islam under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It was always a part of our aspirations. If you could find one of those old Muhammad Speak newspaper, there were hands reaching over and across the globe from America to Africa. So it was always an aspiration. Thinking of a young man right now who is an ambassador, graduate from Claire Muhammad School in Atlanta, Georgia, Waleed Shamsuddin. He's an ambassador to Africa now. And then we've had embassies going over. I myself has been a part of it. So the connections were made after Imam Muhammad and after the passing of Elijah Muhammad. So that the fruit of that aspiration, the realization of that aspiration, has been happening since that time. But before Elijah Muhammad passed away in a formal way, there was no real formal connection there. Okay. We're getting close to that time, so
I have a question from the gentleman here.
Okay, go.
With all the evidence of Al-Islam being so powerful and influential in our history, what purpose did historians such as Dr. Ben and Chancellor Williams in deliberating, distorting that evidence, and attempting to shine a negative light on Al-Islam?
Yeah, and I started part one of this presentation included a reference to a book that was done by Brother Yasser Muhammad that is grounded in the refutation of all of those, using even their own words. Those people that say like Chancellor Williams, his thing was identified as the destruction of Black civilization, destruction of African civilization, whatever the name was. So Yasser Muhammad, he covers all of that. I'm so confident in where it is read. I didn't bother to pull out a whole lot of quotes from it. But in terms of that, it's a pushback against. It's the same. How can you say anti-Islamic? Attack and claim and charge that Islam somehow undermined African civilization, when you look at the high points and the high history of the continent itself. It is grounded in what was done by Muslim Africans. So it really has no value, or had no value, and doesn't, except for those people that need an anti-Islamic rationale in the voice of an intellectual that they can feel comfortable with and say, he speaks for me. But beyond that, when you talk about the truth of it, there's no truth to it.
And if I can add to that a little bit, this is maybe conspiratorial, like conspiracy theory, but there were also rumors that due to the increasing tide of people converting to Islam in America, that there needed to be some kind of propaganda tool to stop that increase, and that Chancellor Williams, he was possibly even commissioned to write the book. So for that very purpose, to decrease the desire, the yearning, or whatever the conversion rate for that. And then African nationalists too, there was a kind of an issue with many of them also adopting the I kind of like a misbelief that everything in Africa was good. So, go back to, in fact, I think stepsisters didn't like this, multiple wives, the dashikis, everything, kind of looking at it in a superficial manner. And that it kind of played into the African nationalists also not really considering Islam. They did in some ways, they quote about, Mansa Musa, but again, there was really a kind of a lack of knowledge about Islamic history that kind of somehow pervaded them because of this.
Yes.
And then there's another, it says, Assalamu alaikum, your inspiration to deliver this documentary during Ramadan is also subject to the blessings of Ramadan.
Amen.
What did you ask of Allah?
Well, what did I ask of Allah? What do you mean? What did I ask of Allah? No,
expound on that?
No, alhamdulillah. I mean, for me, mashallah, I look for a moment that I count as the heart being rested. If I decide to do something and then my heart is just completely at rest about it, no matter what magnitude the thing is, it's like, okay, yeah, this is what we're doing. So, you know, my prayers, they're basically always the same. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Give us the excellent things in this world, excellent things in the world to come, and save us from the chastisement of the fire. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. Oh Allah, give us mates and offspring that will be beautiful in our eyes, and give us the grace to be examples for righteous people. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملت على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. Oh Allah, forgive us our faults and anything we may have done to transgress our duties. Establish our feet firmly and help us against those who stand against faith. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum. So inshallah, tomorrow at 11 Pacific time, we'll begin to address the Robbery Part 2 adaptation. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Mubarak.
Wa alaikum assalam. Ramadan Mubarak, brother, man.
Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak.
Excellent presentation.
Shukran.
Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak. Shukran. Yeah. So what time you got? Here, here you go. Thank you. She'll take this. Yeah, baby.
I'm getting tired stuff.
Oh, okay. He gone?
He's coming back. He just told us back when you're done. You gather it up.
All righty then. Thank you. Excellent. Appreciate it. Battery right there. Thank you so much
Alhamdulillah.
for the backup and the backstop and the nets and the cushions.
Grateful to be of service.
Mujahid.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala falah. Hayya